During the First World War, visits by Allied staff officers to Woolwich underlined the re-emergent military importance of the town and of the arsenal. The area had been economically depressed since the end of the Boer War and the layoffs at the arsenal that had followed. But the new prosperity that this war would bring would be bought at a terrible human cost. Although the use of cavalry on the Western Front still featured in military plans, in Beresford Square the use of electricity to power the trams and the petrol engine were replacing the horse. This was an age of rapid technological change. Victory would be as dependent on the output of the factories as on the frontline armies, and the mass mobilization of civilians in support of the war effort would lead to social changes that are with us today. The fortunes of Woolwich had ebbed and flowed with those of the Arsenal for 200 years, and the square's market traders had worked against the backdrop of the same great gateway as they do today. But before 1915, the inside of the gate's arches were unknown to women workers. In this war, the town's skilled engineers and craftsmen would work alongside the women as tradition gave way to necessity. In the place that made shot and cannon for Marlborough and Wellington, Vanborough's elegant 18th century foundry would now preside over a 20th century war factory of unimagined scale. The Baroque cast-iron splendour of the foundry doors gave little clue as to the modern nature of the heavy engineering processes within. The age of steel had succeeded the age of wrought and cast iron. Advances in scientific and craft knowledge had pushed forward the limits of design and technology as nations sought the competitive advantages of industrial warfare. Molten streams of high-grade gun steel poured from the furnaces as foundrymen strove to meet the endless demands for guns. Guns which the army hoped would help them break the deadlock on the Western Front, guns to arm the country's merchant fleet, and guns for the Navy's warships. The Arsenal's 3,000-ton forging press worked tirelessly to shape the white-hot steel ingots in an unceasing rhythm of production as the factories took up 24-hour working. It was not unknown at the start of the war for men to work 96 hours a week for a month at a time with only a single day's break. The demands on men and machinery were unremitting. Skilled engineering workers were desperately recruited as the factories expanded to meet wartime demands. But this would not be enough. More guns needed more shells. During the opening barrage of the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in 1915, more shells would be fired than had been fired in the whole of the Boer War. The Army Commander-in-Chief, Sir John French, grew increasingly frustrated as the ratio of shells to guns fell. In an interview with the Times, he said, in effect, that soldiers had died because of the shortage of shells. The resulting political scandal forced the Prime Minister, Asquith, into coalition government and saw control of the arsenal transferred from Kitchener's War Office to a newly created Ministry of Munitions under the fiery Welsh Chancellor Lloyd George. Although the arsenal's importance in gun production would be eclipsed during the war as the private arms industry rapidly expanded, the unique skills and abilities in design and specialist production of the workers at Woolwich remained in demand. Nearly all of the Navy's new guns would be designed here, and the proximity of the testing range at Shoeburyness continued to ensure the arsenal's usefulness. Weapons were designed and produced that allowed opposing forces to engage each other from beyond the horizon, as the spatial boundaries of modern mechanical warfare extended to previously unknown limits, and targets became little more than mathematical abstractions. Echoes of the 19th century lingered in the Royal Carriage Department, where the wheelwright's skills and materials he used would have been familiar to the cannon builders here a century before. The Arsenal's original sawmill had been designed by Marc Brunel, the father of Isambard, for the lesser needs of a previous age. Although pneumatic tyres had been developed by J.B. Dunlop nearly 30 years earlier, field gun carriages and limbers continued to use the steel-rimmed timber wheel. But the Arsenal's larger caliber guns needed a more substantial mounting, and the skills of the engineer and the plater would be called on to make gun carriages suitable for the unforgiving conditions of the Flanders battlefields. As with the gun factory, a large part of the carriage department's work was in the repair of equipment worn or damaged in service, and Woolwich became the hub of a constant cycle of shipments to and from both British and Allied armies around the world. The Arsenal's location on the river provided direct access for all kinds of craft. The canal, part of which is now preserved at Broadwater, was connected to the river by lock gates. In addition to timber for the mills, both food and materials for ordnance production were brought in on the Thames. Britain was dependent on the merchant fleet, not only for war supplies, but for provisions to feed the population. All of the country's sugar, 80% of its cheese and grain, and about half of its meat, eggs, fruit and vegetables were imported. As the war went on, and German submarines took their toll of the merchant shipping fleet, the Arsenal found it more difficult and much more costly to find the provisions it needed to feed up to 100,000 workers daily in its 72 enormous dining rooms. The Arsenal's own railway system, Royal Arsenal Railways, expanded from a pre-war 90 miles of track to a total length of over 150 miles by 1917. Both standard and 18-inch narrow gauge were in use and were often run together. This placed great strain on the system when a single line had to handle up to 4 streams of traffic. American-style spark arresters were used on many engines, working amongst the thousands of tons of stored munitions. Royal Arsenal Railways also operated a passenger service, complete with timetables and first, second and third class carriages. In addition to its use in showing off the enormous size of the Arsenal to visiting VIPs, it served more practically in transporting the tens of thousands of workers who needed to cover 2 miles or more between the main gates and the farthest factories. The force's hunger for men of fighting age led Lloyd George to enter an agreement with the trade unions in 1915 that would release 11,000 Arsenal men to serve with the colours in its first year alone. These men could to some extent be replaced by men too old for military service or wounded men unfit for further active service, but it was boys and especially women that took the men's places. In 1917, the Arsenal employed 7,700 boys. Many lived at home, often with parents who also worked at the Arsenal, but around 1 in 10 lived in Spartan shed-like hostels on the Churchfield estate. The hostels included chapels for the boys' spiritual well-being, as well as the refectories that fed their physical needs. But above all, it was the women that shouldered the burden of munitions work. Recruiting campaigns supported by the national newspapers gave munitions work an image of respectability that few female occupations of the time offered. Nationally, hundreds of thousands of women would quit the poor pay and conditions of domestic service for the social and economic freedom of the munitions plants, and girls and married women who had not previously worked joined the labour force in unprecedented numbers. The war was a watershed in British social history. Afterwards, women could no longer be denied the vote. The development of labour-saving domestic appliances would also accelerate as society started to become accustomed to the idea of wives and mothers as workers. The downside to these changes would become apparent at the end of the war. The government's agreement with the trade unions that had allowed women into the Arsenal in 1915 was effective only for the duration. 90% of the 26,000 women employed in the Arsenal in 1917 would be laid off by April 1919. Although women demonstrated that their skills on the lathes were equal to those of the men, their access to skilled work remained limited. In Woolwich, this was partly due to working agreements that dated back to 1896. The new national factories, unhampered by such restrictions, used women for up to 70% of skilled work. In the Arsenal, the figure was little more than 5%. The concentration of women on the filling and assembly of explosive components exposed them to a danger that was not apparent at the start of the war. As TNT replaced picric acid as an explosive, workers became ill with what was termed at the time toxic jaundice. The first 2 deaths at the Arsenal came in March 1916. When the Daily Mail printed a critical article on safety standards, government censors ordered the suppression of all further mention of TNT poisoning in the press. But safety regulations were eventually introduced a year after the first deaths. In addition to regular medical examinations, munitions plants had to provide both protective clothing and milk, which was thought to counteract the effects of the poison. The enduring image of women in the Great War is that of munitions workers, but by 1918 war weariness at home was becoming more noticeable. Despite the continuing uncritical support of the press for the war effort, the scale of the slaughter on the Western Front had become more widely understood. The failure of the Somme offensive, in which the guns had fired 60 shells a second during an hour-long opening barrage, led even those in government to question whether a military solution to the war could be achieved. The enormous costs of war production had almost bankrupted Britain. Pleading to the United States for a war loan, the Foreign Secretary Balfour said, "We are now on the brink of a precipice, and unless immediate help is given, financial collapse will follow." But even before the end of the war came, in November 1918, the future of the Arsenal was being debated. The low efficiency and high costs of production at Woolwich led a commission of inquiry to recommend closure in favour of the more efficient national factories. The linked fortunes of Woolwich and the Arsenal would lead the town to feel the full brunt of the post-war depression. But this would not be the end of the Arsenal story.